Americanization, the melting pot and assimilation into mainstream American society. In America today, the term white people typically encompasses all those either descended from Europeans or native of the continent. Regardless of hair color, accents, or certain ethnic features, we consider that person white. And if the person in question is residing in the country and versed in English, possibly even American. A white person born in the United States is American, no question asked. However, many wonder if the same logic can be applied to persons of Hispanic, Asian, and Black ancestry born in the United States. Historically, in the United States, minorities have never been granted quite the same status and privileges as white, and to this day still haven't. People of differing sexual orientations have found themselves overcoming obstacles as well, with gay marriage still prohibited in many states and discrimination in both the military and the workplace, causing many to wonder if America is truly the melting pot it claims to be.
During the 20th century, whiteness was determined by one's ethnic heritage, accent, and religious views, and those deemed non-white were subject to harassment, discrimination, and occasional violence. Crossing into the wrong neighborhood, that was, a neighborhood occupied by a different social class or ethnicity than oneself, could warrant a variety of outcomes, similar to the racial makeup of inner-city neighborhoods today. Restricted mobility considerably, and societal pressure encouraged ethnicities to marry within their own culture. Around the turn of the century, things began to change, however. Increasingly, Anglo-Americans were beginning to see the potential of a unified, industrious America. Thus began Americanization, a process of deculturalizing immigrants and allowing them to integrate into the greater American culture.
One of the earlier Americanization movements started in 1915 with the organization of Americanization Day, a holiday which would later become to be known as Loyalty Day, a day dedicated to reaffirming loyalty and discussing American values. The hardworking immigrants had already fulfilled the Protestant work ethic by toiling endlessly to make ends meet, knew at least some English, and many of them had served in America's war, thus expressing their willingness to integrate and become Americans.
By the time the Second World War rolled around, the ethnic identities that separated European immigrants from the Anglo majority had more or less fallen away. At the turn of the century, especially within urban areas such as New York and San Francisco, they were as definitive as race, and allegiance was owed primarily to one's own ethnic group or motherland in the United States. Such identities as Irish American, Jewish American, and Polish American began to gradually fall away, as all the ethnicities of Europe and the Mediterranean became merely known as white, and became equal to one another. Dissimilarly, racial minorities remained in more or less the same positions they had occupied previously. Violence and aggression towards minorities ranged from hooliganism, such as the Zoot Suit riots against Mexican-American Pachucos, to the government-sanctioned deportations en masse of Japanese-American citizens to internment camps such as Manzanar, and, of course, mob lynchings of blacks in the South. Years later, returning servicemen were granted little to no further rights, and in the South faced the exact same discrimination they had hoped to reverse upon enlisting. When Ruby Bridges had to be escorted to class by U.S. Marshals and the Birmingham riots consumed Alabama, any kind of equality seemed the subject of fantasy. Where in earlier times European immigrants had faced stereotypes, notably Sicilians and the Mafia, or the Irish Papists, they were never subject to the same levels of discrimination, isolation, or brutality that racial minorities living in the United States endured, nor did they face as extreme obstacles integrating into American society. Though blacks had been a part of American society since colonial times, it took over 2 centuries before freedom was a guarantee. Mexicans who found themselves under United States rule prior to territorial annexations were frequently lynched, attacked, and shot by white settlers, while many free blacks lost their freedom, which were previously protected under the Mexican Constitution. East Asian immigrants from China and Japan faced similar hardships, constantly changing immigration laws, and with the Immigration Act of 1924, all immigration, with the exception of Western Europe, was slowed to a trickle.
When it comes to integrating into the mainstream, LGBT people have faced considerable obstacles and to this day have yet to be melted down into mainstream accepted Americans. Having endured public beatings, harassment, and police brutality, considerable discrimination in the workplace is also common. It is not uncommon for LGBT people to conceal their differences, especially in the professional field. Lieutenant Dan Troy, a veteran of the Second Gulf War, was discharged after coming out as gay. like the 442nd Regiment, recruited from behind the barbed wire at Manzanar or the Tuskegee Airmen, Lieutenant Dan Troy attempted to break down barriers through service, but in the end was betrayed by those he risked his life for. The concept of the melting pot aimed to alter the immigrant by tailoring him or her to become more Americanized, by leaving certain cultural elements behind, retaining others, and embracing American cultural expectations such as Christianity, the ability to speak and understand English, and motivation to better the country. Though, by 1950, ethnic distinction had mostly all but vanished. Race was still an issue and still is in the modern day. The war on terror has done nothing but intensify fear and loathing, while demographic shifts across the country often are met with racial hostilities. From the shootings of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown to the broken immigration system that has turned so many families apart, it's impossible to ignore the fact the melting pot hasn't been turned up all the way. Hopefully, the millennials will do what their forebears could not and finally draw these painful chapters of American history to a close.